there's a commuter train that runs across the path. And it was just sitting there, off hours. And, it's a ladder on the back. You just climb it like you would a tree or a jungle gym. We really did not think we were getting in anything particularly nuts. But I happened to be the first one up the ladder, and I had a metal watch on, and I got close enough to the power lines and the electricity arc to the watch. And that was that.
So I'd like to start kind of wide and maybe oversimplified with two very important definitions for me to understand. One is what is palliative care and what is hospice, and maybe some of the differences if there are some.
Oh yeah, Takis, thank you. That's a beautiful opener. The world gets, it's just really hard to know what it's for some reason our field has a real branding issue. No one knows what the hell we do. So and it's a big problem. So thank you. So we could talk about this for hours. Let me see if I can keep it short. But palliative care, if you look at the World Health Organization or CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, or the Center to Advance Palliative Care, they'll all have a definition of palliative care that's a couple paragraphs long. So it gets detailed. But in essence, palliative care is the interdisciplinary medical specialty that pursues quality of life and treats suffering within the context of serious illness. So that's it. So basically, the interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life is the simplest way to put it. It is. It gets. There's no mention in that definition of death or anything else. But we get conflated with hospice all the time because hospice is sort of our origin. So hospice. Now let me just define hospice. Hospice is a subtype of palliative care that is focused on the final months of life. So, since 2006, the medical specialty is called hospice and palliative medicine. That's the field, its full title. So, if I, as a physician, I've gotten training in hospice and palliative medicine, I could apply palliative care in the end of life sphere in hospice, or I could do palliative care farther upstream. Like in my clinic, I've seen people for 10, 11, 12 years, so who are not necessarily anywhere near end of life. So it gets super confusing because hospice came first. It came from the UK in the 70s. The modern hospice made its way to the North America in the 70s. And in the 80s, Medicare got in the business and designated the Medicare hospice business. So it made a hospice benefit. And that is sort of define the field. So to qualify the hospice benefit, this insurance designation, you have to have 6 months or less to live, and you have to give up curative intended care to get hospice. So those are these two big forks in the road that define hospice as an insurance designation and can be very confusing. And so you can see how, a lot of us who've worked in this field in hospice, you start saying, well, why do we wait till people are in their final hours of life to start swarming them with love and caring about how they feel and checking in on their family and working on their quality of life? Why do we wait till the end of life to do that? So in the 90s, palliative care grew up around hospice and the hospice benefit to get away from these false forks in the road of 6 months or less to live or giving up any kind of care. So does that make some sense, Takis?
It does, for sure.
Good.
Speaking also of definitions and clarity, it always struck me, and I'd ask you if this is accurate, that medicine is matter-of-fact, data-driven, objective clinical trials, and suffering is a subjective, huge spectrum. Is there accuracy in that, and how do you grapple with such a rigid form, which is medicine is this, and suffering is this? How do you bring them together if that was an accurate difference?
It is. It very much is. And it tells you why, on some level, you would think as a layperson, one of the challenges the field of palliative care has is, as a layperson, I might say, well, what's special about this? I mean, isn't my regular doctor somehow concerned with my quality of life and trying to help me not suffer? I mean, isn't that what all of healthcare should be doing on some level? And I agree with that. But the way healthcare has gone in the last 120 plus years is, as you say, this pursuit of the scientific method, of randomized control trials and controlled trials in general, objectivity, that the vagaries of individualism, one person to the next, are in a way a problem for medicine. We want to find the things that can treat all people or big cohorts of people. One person at a time kind of thinking really bedevils medical research, as you might imagine. So we've kind of fleed over this last, and medicine has done and had made incredible advances um, in this scientific way over the last 100 plus years. That's great. But what has happened is all that pursuit of objectivity and homogenization and reproducibility of the results, et cetera, has meant that subjective things have gotten squeezed out. So how I feel as a patient is kind of irrelevant to to the way medicine works. We're trying to get your disease to go away or to shrink. We're following your molecules, not how you feel about things. And so, yes, the divide you're pointing attention here, Takis, is exactly right. And this is why the field of palliative care had to come along as a subspecialty, even though every patient in the healthcare system dies at some point. Every patient in the healthcare system suffers. You'd think these are the most universally approached and addressed issues, but in fact, they're not. So palliative care had to come along as a specialty, as something of a corrective to the system to reacquaint healthcare with the vagaries of individuals, of the subjective life of any person. Otherwise, that stuff has been crowded out, and we've all suffered for it. If you've been through the healthcare system, you'll feel this one way and another. So, yes, you are absolutely right about that, and that is the bridge that palliative care is trying to build between the subjective and the objective.
Thinking of the subjective, the objective, and how much words matter, keep in mind, I don't know what I'm talking about for our listeners here, but I assume if you see a doctor, you get a blood test, the blood test shows XYZ, you get a scan, it shows XYZ. But in terms of me explaining my suffering, is there almost an art form? Because you can experience suffering and have a dozen words to describe it, and I could experience exactly what you're experiencing and use the most random words. Is in your position, is it almost an art form to understand and figure out what they're trying to explain? And as a patient, is it almost important to be an effective communicator? Because in some ways, all we have is our words to describe suffering, which doesn't seem very scientific.
It is not scientific. I cannot, there's no test that allows me to quantify or objectify a patient's suffering. And that's its challenge, but it's also one of its charms because this levels the playing field. So if I'm an oncologist and you have cancer, I probably know more about your cancer than you do. I'm the boss of the molecular, the focus of treatments to push back on that cancer. It's probably true that I know more about your cancer than you do. If the goal, however, is for you to have quality of life, for you to feel like you've found meaning and purpose in your life, to optimize your life, your time on this planet while you have it, how you feel about things becomes entirely important and is entirely your domain. I don't have any expertise over how you feel. So part of the joys, if challenging, but part of the joys of this work is, yeah, the subject inherently levels the playing field. Doctor and patient are two human beings trying to find their way to feeling as well as possible. That's a collaboration. That's not the patient lying still and shutting up while I, the doctor, perform my sort of tricks on them. So yes, it is. This does make it all very messy, and it also makes it very wonderful and endlessly fascinating. Um, and to your point about words, yes, words are incredibly important, but we do have more than words. I mean, communication is meted out at the body language, a level of body language and vibes, and we kind of feel our way as human beings with each other all the time. And this is no different. And this is why if you ask a palliative care person to rewrite medical school curricula, it would have a lot more to do with how to learn how to listen well, how to read people well, how to stoke your own empathy. Because suffering is universal, No matter what words you choose, Takis, to describe to me your feelings, if my antenna are well tuned, I'm going to empathize my way towards an understanding, not just following the logic of your vocabulary. And so, empathy, compassion, listening, these are the tools of the trade, which is beautiful because as a patient, that's what I want to feel from my doctor. So, you'll meet most palliative care crew are pretty emotionally intelligent people, are almost inherently kind. There's something sort of generous about this work because of its deference to you, the patient, your experience. Does that make sense?
Totally. It sounds like this comes from a great deal of experience. This is very much, it sounds like an art form, which sounds strange to talk to a doctor about an art form.
Mm,
But you also
mm,
mentioned briefly that you wish that in schooling and training that some form of emotional intelligence, body language, linguistics
hmm
would have
hmm
been more prominent. Are you saying it should be more prominent, or is there almost no training whatsoever for a traditional doctor?
There is pretty much no training. I mean,
Wow.
it's not really part of the puzzle. It's sort of presumed that over time and put yourself in front of enough people, you will kind of somehow osmotically learn these things, or by virtue of being a human being, a clever human being who is clever enough to get into medical school, somehow in your life you've learned how to communicate well, etc. But we know that's not true. So no, for the most part, medical school, nursing school, social work, chaplaincy, none of these curricula have much or any training on communication, on listening, on self-care, so that your antenna are clean, so that you're self-aware to enough to know to parse your own feelings from your patients, etc. I mean, doctors are terrible. We're projecting onto people all the time. We're counter transferring all the time, and we're confusing our feelings with theirs, or we treat people how we think they should be versus how they actually are. That's a very different experience for both parties. So, one of the things we're learning right now is this doesn't. This is one. These are the ways that medicine doesn't work well for patients and families, but it's also one of the ways it doesn't work well for clinicians because we're missing the mark all the time. We're not trained to actually navigate the stuff that's happening between doctor and patient very well. We keep trying to objectify and ram it into some structure that is not native or natural. And it shows. This burnout is a huge problem in medicine for a reason.
That lack of training and trust in experience, it's kind of shocking and a little bit sad. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah,
For whatever
yeah.
reason, I thought a major part would have been communication. You're communicating with a person first and then the symptoms second. But that surprised me and makes me
Mm.
a little bit sad. How does that make you feel? Or are you hopeful that in the future we're going to start incorporating far more of these practices in traditional training?
It is a little disappointing. It is a little upsetting. The sort of short sightedness of how medical education was wired, the presumptions, the assumptions that went into it. But I have a lot of compassion for my colleagues in healthcare, knowing how we were all trained, knowing the workload. Just trying to master the information alone doesn't leave a lot of room for open-ended questions and navigating silence and feelings. I mean, if you got 15 minutes to see a patient and to cover all sorts of things, you know, even if we were trained on a lot of other things, we weren't going. We're not. The system doesn't allow us to get to those things. So I don't know where to place my frustrations, but I have them. More to the point, what to do with them is this is why I'm excited that a field like palliative care exists to come along to try to fill these gaps, to try to come along and to make to heal these rifts and to build these bridges. So yes, the need is disappointing on some level and profound, and I'm also optimistic that as even in my 15 years in the field, it's come a long way. I mean, it's only since 2006 that it's officially existed, and we've made a pretty big splash. So I think we're heading in a better direction. Of course, it's taking longer than I and a lot of my colleagues would want, but it's happening. So I'm both optimistic and disappointed, and the two play off each other pretty nicely.
There was a moment, this is the exact moment when we reached out to try to have this conversation. I was watching you talk in front of a full theater, and you asked who here hasn't suffered? Put your hand up. So put your hand up if you haven't suffered. And there wasn't silence. There wasn't an uncomfortable moment. There was laughter. Everyone just
Hmm.
laughed in the entire theater. So I really loved that moment, but also it
Hmm.
reminded me of how you talk about humor. And is
Hmm.
humor a big part of making light of the human condition and suffering? And is humor a big part of your day with your patients and even yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we're dealing with heavy duty subject matter. And if we're trying to help each other suffer less and feel better, well, humor is a big piece of how we do that, how humans metabolize difficult situations. So, sure is. Absolutely. And some of the funniest places you'll ever hang out would be in a back, like a break room at a hospice. You can imagine there's just sort of dark humor. There's just awkward things happening all the time, weird smells, bodies coming apart, people saying funny things. I mean, it's just, and part of the joy of this work is celebrating the spectrum, the breadth of human experience that includes pain, includes suffering. But that pain and suffering is also this very stuff that is a great foil for joy, for laughter, for for belonging in this world. So it's all of a piece, and you stick around this subject long enough, and you realize how suffering and joy kind of need each other. So yeah, and one of the ways that people die before they have to die is because people start putting kid gloves on and they don't want to say certain things. They don't want to laugh. They think it's supposed to be so solemn and so we start cutting ourselves off from each other before we have to. We do this also around the sexual planes, a big thing. Like we doctors, most patients will tell you the doctors never ask them about their sexual lives, especially in a serious illness when their bodies are doing all sorts of things that aren't necessarily considered sexy. But that's an elemental piece of being human, and doctors rarely bring that up, and people suffer for that. So I'd say yes with laughter, but I'd say just the bigger point here is the whole spectrum of human experience should always be relevant, should always be included in any conversation about someone trying to find meaning in their lives and trying to optimize their lives.
This is just kind of a random thought, and I'd ask you if this has any accuracy, but are those who do your work, people that are so close to suffering, so close to death, in fact, some of the most, zen or calm or light people on earth because
Hmm.
they've been so close to it? Or is there a lot of suffering in your life and in the employees that do this job? I just wonder.
Mhm.
I don't see a middle ground. I either see these people being incredibly zen and at peace and finding ways to laugh and celebrate life, or going home incredibly stressed out and
Mm.
seeing the darkness. Is there that wide gap, or is it somewhere in the middle?
I think, in my own experience and people I know, it's both. I mean, I think there is a sort of a constitution of people who are attracted to this work because another way of describing palliative care is working on things that you can't fix. If medicine's trying to find problems that it can solve for, the abandonment moment happens in healthcare when you're no longer fixable. Then when the doctor says, hey, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do, ostensibly to cure you. So, by some measure, healthcare becomes irrelevant when you're not fixable. And what a that's a real abandonment. But if you take your cue as that, there's always something that humans can do for each other to help each other feel a little bit better, whether that's bear witness or treat symptoms or just listen, or human touch. So there's always something human beings can do to help each other feel better. That's so yeah, this problem of abandonment, of fixing it, so constitutionally people who are drawn to doing palliative care work are signing up to sit with things that they can't fix, sit with suffering that they can't necessarily take away. So it is very hard work that way. And what constitutes success in palliative care can be difficult to gauge. So it is a setup for an emotional complexity at work that can both drive us to develop a sort of capacity to be with these things and in a way kind of go that Zen route like you're describing. Um, But we're also human beings ourselves, and we're also asked to do impossible things and see too many people, and we're rushed, and um, and we're sitting. If the more compassionate I am, the more I am absorbing other people's pain, and that takes its toll. So I find myself um, pretty moody, and a little bit dark sometimes. Um, but it's more like I've made peace with that. So I am not without my darkness. It's more like I have gotten better at living with darkness and therefore finding joy amidst it, if that makes sense.
Totally. I recently had a conversation with a psychologist about social media consumption and some of the chaos that we see online. And while he told me that there's a major component culturally why people might be a little bit more angry in an anonymous, non face to face setting, he also said
Hmm.
just biologically, evolutionary psychology says that that mean tweet might trigger something deep within you as a threat. So bringing it back to this conversation, our fear of death, is it biological? Is it within every single one of us and it's not going away? Or is this cultural? It is something we are taught to don't talk about that thing. It's a bad thing, scary thing, stay away. Or deep within us, it doesn't matter how at peace you are, that fear is just a part of this human experience.
You know, I think that there's some both here. I think that we are wired. We have a trauma response. Anything that is a threat to our existence, we have a fight or flight or freeze response at the neurological level and the traumatic acute threatening level. There's not much to be done about that. I mean, that is a reflex. So on some level that we are wired for this, but I think a lot of the machinations, the fears, the narratives, the scaring. I mean, look at our films around death. Like death and zombies and Frankenstein, and death is handled in a certain way culturally that isolates us, push farther and farther from the truth of it, because we don't. It's a messy truth, so we try to ignore it, and then, of course, that just makes things worse over time because we've stuffed it in a closet, and then when it finally comes out, it's we've created a monster where there may have not been one. So I think it's a little bit of both. I do find that people like so many things that one can get used to in this life. I am an advocate for us all pondering our mortality earlier in life because it's coming, no matter what we do, because it's a fact of life. Because part of the salve here to mitigating this fear is linking death with life. Death is a part of life, not this thing that robs us of life. And the more we can associate our lives with our deaths, then the more comfortable we might feel, the more we might realize we actually know a thing or two about it. And so I do think there's a basic fear in most or all of us, but that over time can be worked with and mollified and accommodated in such a way that by the time you get to your death, you may not be afraid at all, or even if you are afraid, you're used to that fear and you have a relationship to that fear and you can live with that fear. I think that's a better goal than trying to get rid of the fear of death, is learn how to actually live with that fear rather than be overwhelmed by it.
We talked about medical school and some of the changes that can help doctors, but going back on that topic and even 20 years ahead, speaking foundationally, speaking about how parents can talk to their kids about death in elementary
Hmm.
school, is it important at a young age to be around these ideas? How would you, as a parent or as
Hmm.
a grade five teacher, start having these conversations? And at what age
Hmm.
is it appropriate and healthy? Because I know certainly in my experience, we didn't talk about death. And if it was a funeral, we barely talked about that. I was in my high school experience before really thinking about mortality, and that can be
Hmm.
kind of traumatic. And maybe it would be
Hmm.
healthier if at age 8 or 9 I kind of had an idea of what was going on. So how would you talk to
Hmm.
kids, and is it appropriate at a young age?
I think my bias is it is. I'm not an educator in this way. I couldn't cite you data, but my sense is it is, and I have spoken at grade schools before on this topic, and it has gone generally pretty well. So, the way I think about it is, because if once you start kind of tuning into death, you start seeing it all over the place, you know. So I don't know that grade school teachers out there have to do so much to sort of define a curriculum to introduce death to the class. But when death arises in the class, either through a loved one of a class of one of the kids, or a kid themselves, or a favorite pet, or in autumn with leaves falling from the tree, which is a kind of death. You start tuning into it, it's all over the place, or death on the news. So it's more like we don't have to necessarily go out and court some way to introduce death to kids. It's around all the time. So it's more like we should get out of the way and quit blocking it out of our field of view. Work with it as it comes up. I can say that I would advocate for that at least. But you could probably do more than that. But at the very least, just get out of the way. Quit blocking it.
That's a really good point. Quit hiding it, quit blocking it.
Yeah.
Going back to suffering and the extreme spectrum, which I'm really, really fascinated by, because the word suffering, it can account for so many different things. And going
Mhm.
back to your own life and your own experience, and if you could briefly talk about your traumatic moment, did you ever feel like I'm on this side of suffering and there's separation? I am not on this side of suffering. I had a rough sleep yesterday and I have a headache, and I say, well, I'm suffering from a headache. Did you ever, from your experience or people that you help, see, oh no, we're this suffering? This
Mm.
that suffering isn't real. Did you feel a gap in your own life and the people you take care of versus, guys like me who say I have a minor headache?
Well, let's see here. Let me make sure I understand your question. In other words, are there gradations of suffering that I saw in myself or on my own injuries, or sufferings that certain that I feel that I have access to and some that I don't? Or can you help me understand the question a little bit?
After your injury, did you see a separation in the suffering experience? As in, no, I'm really suffering these people's minor illnesses, their anxiety, their
Ah,
depression. Their Did you see a gap between you and other people who claimed suffering?
not really. I saw others project a gap at me. Like people often will say, "Well, God, I've not gone through anything like you've gone through," and sort of discount their own suffering because ostensibly mine is more voluminous or something like that. No, but like we've started our conversation, suffering is subjective. So I think we do a lot more damage comparing and contrasting our sufferings than just trying to own the sensation for its own for ourselves. I don't see a huge difference between the suffering I had losing some limbs and the suffering I had losing my sister and the suffering I had losing my girlfriend, like breaking up with a girlfriend or losing my car keys. They're all they all have a lot of overlap, which is just basically, God, something happened that I wish hadn't happened, and it feels like shit. So I leave it at that. I don't. I think we do a lot of trouble. We go through a lot of trouble and accidentally isolate ourselves, which is just a way to suffer more by sort of making my suffering special. Yours isn't enough. That kind of junk really is not only not helpful, I think it's actually pretty hurtful. So if I'm hearing your question right, no, I've been pretty disciplined to not separate my suffering from those of others and not compare them at all.
To get to that point, was that just age and maturity, or did you go through grief and anger, or was it your parents? Did you have a support system? Because I'm sure a lot of kids listening right now, including myself, would probably have been a lot more angry and say, why me, for 10 years, and blame other
Hmm.
people for X, Y, and Z. And maybe you had that period, but for you to talk about how you never created a gap in suffering is pretty special, and I just wonder how you got to that point in your life.
Um, well, I think I grew up. My mom was has lives with a disability from polio. I was no stranger to seeing a body do things that the owner of that body wished it wouldn't. That I was aware that we don't always get what we want on some very basic visceral level. I was very aware that how we need each other as human beings because we suffer, that we are interdependent, and that's not a weakness. That is an important piece of the experience. So I kind of knew that stuff going in. I knew that that human beings, no matter what they look from the outside, I knew human beings could have a lot of pain on the inside. So I was pretty, as a melancholy-ish child, I was pretty tuned in to this idea that pain, one way or another, was all over the place. So that helped me a lot. I had my mother's example that helped me a lot. I had a good education that helped me kind of learn how to see things and learn how to play with my own perspective and change how I looked at the world. That all helped very, very much. And I think I also just had the time and observation. I wouldn't have been able to have this conversation right now as we're having Takis after 1 or 2 or 3 years after my injuries. It's taken a long time to find the language to parse the concepts out, to own my feelings. Um, but one of the observations early on within the first several years was as painful as it was to lose limbs, I realized that I looked at my own emotional response to like I really mean it, like when I'd lose car keys or a wallet or a breakup, that the pain wasn't all that different really. I mean, I just kind of observed that the variation on the theme of suffering was less important of whether or not you suffered. Like the details, the drama of the story may be different, but in the end, the basic feeling wasn't that much different, and that was an observation. Um, and I think I'll circle back to this one point that I think is so key. As a disabled person, if you buy into this language that you're special, that that's a very slippery. Like sometimes people convey it like it's a compliment. Like you don't have the same rules don't apply to you. You're special. If you buy into that, you're buying into this vehicle that will separate you from the rest of the world. And that separation is the source of so much pain and suffering. So it's a trap. So I think of if I'm special, well then everybody's special. That's the only way I can accept that. And just being kind of clued into how we accidentally isolate ourselves from each other, and that is a source of the pain so often. Put in a different way, when I feel well met, when someone really sees me, when someone really gets me, and we sync up together, that kind of connectivity is so much the salve to suffering. So seeing isolation and separation as part of the problem and seeing connection as the salve was another sort of big point that I learned early on just from experience. I felt it, and therefore it allowed me to learn from it and project it into the world as a physician.
As we're winding down, there's this one brief moment in the documentary Endgame that I thought was very, very profound. And unfortunately, you didn't get to expand on it. So I hope you could do it here, where you talk about this
Hmm.
wedge, and that wedge of, on one side, you have the life you got. On the other side of the
Hmm.
wedge, you have the life that you want. And you mentioned it very briefly. It
Hmm.
was very profound. It stuck with me. And maybe if
Hmm.
you could expand on that as we're winding down, because I think it's a very important, simple, but it's simple, it's obvious, but it's incredibly important to recognize.
Well, I love that definition too. I mean, this is this idea that suffering is a wedge that is in us. It's just sort of this thing that opens up a gap in us, and the gap is, as you say, is the delta, the difference between the reality I have and the reality I wish I had. Um, I, as we've been talking, the reason I love that definition for a number of reasons. One is it doesn't you don't have to qualify that gap. Again, whether it's lost siblings, limbs, or car keys, it's just you got one reality that you have and then one you wish for. It doesn't. It's neutral as to the details of the gap, which I think is inviting and inclusive as we've been talking. So that's one point. Um, Another point is that it's in us. It is we contain that suffering as individuals. Someone may look at my body and they may take away suffering by seeing amputated limbs, and they may project suffering, but I may not be suffering at all. I get that a feeling a lot. People walk around and they get pained look on their faces looking at me, whereas I feel fine. So I think it's important that the suffering is contained, that I own that. It's my wedge, not something that's projected externally. Another big point here, though, is what to do with it. So if we've got on one end the reality we have, and then the other is the reality we wish for. Well, that gives us our two basic responses. As human beings, we can A, quit wishing for a reality that we don't have. That's sort of a Buddhist contemplative route. That is Buddhism in a nutshell. Is how the desire is the source of suffering. So if you can calm your mind, quit projecting and imagining this better place, and really sink into what you have, well, then you're not going to suffer. That closes the gap. And similarly, in a more sort of Western idealized sort of medical, westernized route, well, if you wish you had a reality that you don't have, well, then get busy changing your reality. Work on it, work on yourself, work on the world, work on systems, make things better. Push reality to get closer and closer to this thing that you want it to be. That's the other kind of response. And I like that definition because it gives us a plan of action. And I think most of us do a little of both. We push on reality where we can, try to change it where we can. And when we learn we can't, then ostensibly our acceptance comes in and we settle into it being whatever the hell it's got to be. I think there's a little bit of a nice push pull there. And that's kind of how I navigate it. So that's another reason I love that definition and kind of landed on that for myself to give me some marching orders of what to do with it.
That was very well put. Wrapping up, I have probably a challenging question because there are probably hundreds of different answers, but we imagine they're interesting people and profound people with great insights, but perhaps there are nobody that have a more unique insight or piece of wisdom than someone that is dying. Someone that is dying, you could probably learn so much from. And if there is one in recent memory or something that stood out, someone who was passing away that you learned from them that happened to stick with you, I'm sure there are many, but if there's one that was extra sticky, they're a piece of wisdom as they were passing away.
Well, recently came across a man who was in the state of California. You can hasten your own death legally. If you have a terminal disease, you can apply for medications to get a lethal medication to hasten your own death at your own time of your choosing. I think there are now 10 states that have these laws on the books. They're controversial. There's a lot to say about these laws. That's not really the point here. The point here is that I came across a man who had a long bout of head and neck cancer and was proceeding with this aid in dying medication. And with the blessings of his family, and speaking of communication, he couldn't speak from his cancer, but was able to convey through facial expression and writing exactly how he felt. So he made it very clear to everyone around him that no, that this was he felt joy in this. That death was not this death was this cosmic moment in life, much like birth, and he was approaching it with curiosity and interest and passion and love, not because he loved death per se. It wasn't a morbid pursuit. It was he loved life so much and knew that death was part of his life that he was about to go to some mysterious place that no one he knew had gone to yet. And he found his way to loving that fact. And there was joy around him, even as he was stepping off the planet. Again, not a flight from life, but a love of life that was pulling him through into his death. And death was coming no matter what he did. He was just taking a little bit of agency and taking it on himself, the act on himself. So that was I've seen versions of that where people find their way to loving life so much that their love of life includes death.